2, 3, 4, 5. Thank you very much. That's very clear. I've worked in television for about 40 years, and one thing I've learned is that wherever you are in the world, whether it's a forum or a story or a studio, the pictures will always be there, but not always sound. But anyway, today we all sounded up and we're all sounding good. We have three guests who we're going to discuss the United Nations with. Miroslav Jenka, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas. Miroslav, would you like to just introduce yourself with a paragraph? No more than that?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Good afternoon to all. So my name is Miroslav Jenka. Actually, my background is bilateral foreign service of Czechoslovakia, then Slovakia. I used to be ambassador of Slovakia to Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia. I worked in European Union, in OSCE, and then not so long ago I was head of the Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy for Central Asia, based in Ashgabat. Okay. Since 2015 I am with the United Nations in New York.
Lovely. Gosh, a wide range of experience. So Miroslav, thank you. Next to Miroslav, a rose between two thorns, we have Terhi Hakala, EU Special Representative for Central Asia. Ambassador Terhi is a senior Finnish diplomat. Prior to her current role as EU Special Representative for Central Asia, she was Ambassador for Countering Hybrid Threats of the MFA of Finland. She's also worked as the Director and Director General for Russia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and as Ambassador to the South Caucasus, India and other South Asian countries. So again, huge experience. And alongside Terhi, we have David Chikvedze, Chef de Cabinet, Office of the Director General of the United Nations. David has worked for 40 years, a huge experience in the Foreign Service, in government and in the international civil service. An observer of great power relationships, international geopolitical security and arms control issues in the context of the current Eurasian regional security dynamics and their implications, of course, for the United Nations. He provides since 2006 political advice and support to his fifth Director General of UNOG and Chef de Cabinet. So welcome to you all. Now, why have they come here? Well, I think we're here to examine the UN's role in promoting global peace and security, in conflict prevention, and of course, mediation, resolving disputes. Given the increase, and we heard some of this morning at the plenary session, in great power competition and the rise in conflicts worldwide, what are the mediation prospects for the United Nations peace and security role? Now, by design, the UNSC can't address some of the biggest issues of war and peace in the world. It cannot act to address, mitigate, or stop human suffering in conflict when one of its permanent members is a party to the conflict. Would you say that was a handicap for the UN? What are the challenges facing the UN today, and how have those challenges changed this century? I think those are the questions, for me anyway, that cut straight to the heart of why the UN exists. So what is it there to achieve? Well, according to the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, we face an unprecedented number of crises. Mr. Guterres says the tensions between major powers are at an historic high. That's his words, as are the risks of conflict through misadventure or miscalculation. And I don't think anybody in the room would disagree with that. But then in Hiroshima last month, Mr. Guterres admitted it was time to reform the Security Council and Bretton Woods. The UN, he says, needs to be updated. And I'm asking, how should the UN be updated? And this is a quote: "The global financial architecture is outdated, it's dysfunctional and unfair." These are the words of the UN Secretary General. In the face of the economic shocks from COVID-19, the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it has failed to fulfill its core function as a global safety net. Those are pretty serious allegations or accusations, aren't they? President Biden supports this view and says you need to add new permanent members and promote new norms surrounding veto privileges. So let's dive in straight away and perhaps go to David first. David, do you agree with the Secretary General? Does the UN need reform? If so, what kind of reform?
Thank you, Steve. I will answer that slightly provocative question, but before I do that, I'd like to take this opportunity to say what a pleasure it is to be back in Astana, back in Kazakhstan, and to be, actually it's an honor to be part of the inaugural session of the Astana International Forum. I had the privilege of participating in the Economic Forum once, and I think this is the right moment for this changeover. Of course I agree with my boss. How could I not? However, what I would suggest to you and to all of us is to be mindful of the terminology, some of the terminologies. The United Nations, for one. When you talk about the United Nations not being able to stem this or stop that, or once in a blue moon being successful somewhere, which United Nations are you talking about? Are you talking about Mr. Yensha, me, and 10,000 other people who are the hired help to help the Secretary General perform his functions? Or are you talking about the UN General Assembly, which assembles all 193 members? Are you talking about the UN system, which includes funds, programs, and agencies? Are you perhaps talking about another principal organ, which is the Security Council? More precisely, are you maybe talking about the 5 permanent members of the Security Council? So unless we identify this, we're not going to be able to put our finger on the problem, and if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to find a solution. So with that, of course, I agree with the Secretary General that the Security Council needs reforming, but the problem, the rub here, is that the Security Council itself has to reform itself. And I'll tell you...
So it does need reform?
Of course it does. There are two anachronisms in this little booklet here, the UN Charter. And those two anachronisms are the term enemy states, which they are no longer, and the other is the principle of the unanimity of permanent members. And in that second anachronism, it's a twofer. The anachronism is permanent members, and the anachronism is unanimity. That's what stumps the Security Council. It has stumped the Security Council since 1946, and it continues to do so. But we're not dealing with an organization that's 78 years old. We have to deal with the organization that is 33 years old, after the end of the bipolar world. It changed radically. And there was a moment where it could have been addressed differently. Multilateralism was the flavor of the year. Unfortunately, the UN did not take on these functions. The Secretary General did not get a second term at the time. And we just heard from Helga Schmidt at the plenary, the OSCE, which basically is another mechanism. You have the UN, which is a mechanism. You have the OSCE, which is a mechanism. You have other mechanisms. That wasn't used either. And my last, I don't want to take up all the time, but the last thing about terminology. There is a major conflation of concepts when we hear or we read about multilateralism. And the conflation mainly is between multilateralism as a mindset and multilateralism as its embodiment in international structures and organizations. There is very little wrong with those organizations that cannot be fixed. However, the problem is with the mindset. And throughout history, multilateralism was addressed by the member states, or by the countries, I keep calling them member states as a UN guy, only after they had either stumbled or walked into or ran into a major catastrophe, like the 100-Year War, the Napoleonic Wars, the First World War, the Second World War. The problem here is we are in the same mindset. However, nowadays we cannot afford to have another cataclysm because it may be our last. That's the problem.
And the job of the UN is to avoid a cataclysm. Should we get that right?
The UN Charter was created in order to prevent, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Yeah. Again, if we go to terminology.
Sorry? Which is another way of putting save us from a cataclysm.
Is another way of?
Putting that it's there to save us from a cataclysm.
Yes. Yes. Cataclysm, exactly. Because if we go by the definition of war as any wars,
yes.
There's a major issue there.
Okay.
With regard to a cataclysm, yes, it has done and it's doing its job.
Thank you, David. That's a good setting out your chart there. Miroslav, the reason for my question is the recognition that the Security Council's membership doesn't, as David alluded to, represent the security needs of the international community. Do you agree with that, or what does need reform?
Look, I would like to see one person in this room who wouldn't agree with this. I am sure that if you ask to raise hands, nobody would raise hands. And there is a reason for that. And the reason is that the United Nations was created after the Second World War. The situation at that time was completely different. You know, Africa, for example, as we know it today, did not exist. Security Council, Bretton Woods institutions, at that time they reflected the situation after the Second World War. Now, almost 80 years later, the situation is completely different, but the structures are the same. So definitely reform is not only needed, it is long overdue. But here is a very serious question, because there are certain rules that are enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. To change them, what is necessary, and I see your smile, is consent of 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
It's called Catch-22.
Yes, but then, we heard here, David mentioned it as well, that it is anachronism, etc. But how to cope with this question? Because we also remember League of Nations. And actually the fact that League of Nations didn't have this, permanent members and veto power actually led to catastrophe, and that catastrophe was Second World War. So the major here, demand is to talk together. And I am very happy that today the Astana Forum is about dialogue, because dialogue is absolute necessity here. How we can rebuild trust under the current conditions. How we can come back to bigger solidarity. And when we talk about international law, when we talk about Charter of the United Nations, how we come back to universality, so that it is implemented universally and all members stick to it. Secretary General offered our common agenda, a visionary document for future of the United Nations. Secretary General of OSCE, Helga Schmidt, she mentioned a new agenda for peace. And this new agenda for peace is part of that effort under the roof of our common agenda, how to come back to preventive diplomacy, how to save the future generations from the scourge of war. So yes, reform is needed. But at the same time, United Nations, if some feel that is not necessary, and even I heard you know, to lighten a little bit atmosphere, what UN acronym stands for. So I heard one person saying unnecessary. Just opposite is true. It is very necessary, and then we are preparing for the next General Assembly of the United Nations in September, and we are expecting a record number of heads of states and governments to be there. The interest is enormous because it is the platform that was destined to provide opportunity for world leaders to meet and to solve those pertinent questions.
Let's go to Turkey. As we've heard from David and Miroslav, the Security Council's permanent membership hasn't been changed since the Second World War, since 1946, meaning that 3 of the 5 seats are held by European countries. There are no permanent members from Latin America or Africa, as Miroslav said, and China is the only Asian member. So, Turkey, what kind of reform are we talking about? Or do you think the Secretary General is talking about?
I don't know how you counted the 3 permanent members here, because one of them has claimed to be very much Eurasian nowadays. But thank you very much. It's very good to be here. Actually, I also agree with my friends here, and it's great to be in Astana, and I think it's a very timely forum to discuss these issues. The challenges are big. I come to the question. The challenges are big. We have just faced COVID. Several years disappeared, just like that, actually. The SDG goals, you know, the target day is 2030. We are in big troubles with that. We have the climate risks. We have a big war in Europe. The European Union, actually, which is the biggest donor, member states and union, 25% approximately of the budget of the peacekeeping operation, etc., are financed by the European Union. We see also, of course, the need to reform, and we support wholeheartedly what the Secretary General is proposing, the new agenda for peace, and we also try to be helpful in this respect in many ways because of, our kind of weight as a union, as a donor, and as a partner, true partner to the union or to the UN. The problem here is, as I always say, that, look, we speak of these institutions which are either challenged or which are not succeeding in their endeavors and reaching their goals. We speak about, it's like the European Union. If something goes wrong, it's the European Union. Now we speak about UN sometimes that, oh, it's the UN, it's the Security Council. But actually, what is true is that United Nations, it's us. We are part of the United Nations. There are 193 countries, states, as participant states. And if there is no political will to reform the UN, it's about the political will of all leaders and the governments to reform. And now it's the same applies absolutely to the Security Council. That is, of course, a difficult task because we all know that the P5 permanent members, they have a right to veto any decision, and that is the problem. So the European Union thinks actually that reform is needed, and it has to also concern the Security Council, definitely, because the situation has changed, as Miroslav said. But we need more transparency. We need discussion on this. How we end up in that situation is another question, because the charter is seriously challenged by one of the P5 members, there's a big war, all rules and charters are being breached. So that's where we are. So it's a big challenge. But I'm confident that the dialogue continues on this, and the European Union is part of it and supporting the reform processes.
Should the European Union be one of the permanent members?
Well, I think that this discussion is actually to be discussed. I wouldn't say that European Union as European Union should be part of the discussion has to be a different one, and it's part of the big picture, but the European Union as such, I'm not sure that can be the part of
that's the most evasive answer I've heard.
The fight. Thank you.
Terhi, sorry, I put you on the spot there. This is very unfair of me. I apologize. But you did talk also about if the political will is there. Now, where would that come from? And the political will for what?
The political will to build a prosperous world, peace and sustainable development. I mean, I risk of being naive by saying this, but the fact is that there is no peace without sustainable development. There is no sustainable development without peace and respect for human rights, and that is the core. We are celebrating this year the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 75th anniversary, and look where we are with that too. So I mean, there should be a fundamental discussion on the Charter, respect to the Charter, and the rest of the commitments we've all done, and this covers all aspects of UN, the whole agenda.
Thank you, Terhi. David, coming back to you, and the Security Council and its composition. Does that today, in 2023, damage, do you think, the legitimacy of the Security Council if it's seen as a forum dominated by the West and the great powers, and where the global South countries are largely marginalized?
You know, the beginning of that song goes, "Where do I begin?" Yes, yes, and yes to all of that. Taking advantage of Richard Quest's urging to be blunt and direct and original, which he said was blessed by President Tokayev, I hope it was, I will share with everybody my view how it should be done. It is next to impossible to do because the member states themselves won't do this. But I see a Security Council, the new Security Council. There has to be a political decision by everybody, maybe the General Assembly. But let's not talk about the mechanics. The composition, in my view, should be the G20 plus the African Union plus another 14 countries regionally distributed from the 5 regional regions to make 35 with no permanent members and no veto power. Is it an impossibility? Is it fantasy? Yes, but the human race has managed to achieve things that seemed like fantasy. And the biggest impetus to doing either this or something else is that we no longer have the luxury to continue playing in this sand pit and throwing sand in each other's hair, which is what the 5 permanent members are doing. The world is going in a very bad direction very, very quickly. I am an optimist, so I would not share this view, but I think for a pessimist, it's not a great leap of faith to observe what's happening and think that we are actually in a latent process, a latent beginning of a Third World War.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it is.
It is. I mean, the League of Nations was born out of the First World War.
Yes, you mentioned that.
The United Nations was born out of the Second World War. Perhaps I'm hoping there'll be not another example as you're talking about it, that perhaps now the time is right with the international crisis to form another organization.
I would caution against that. Miroslav's analogy was very valid with the League of Nations. However, the League of Nations was born with a handicap.
Yeah.
The United States was not part of it. And come 1932, Germany withdrew, Russia was kicked out, and we actually never accepted.
Well, the League of Nations was a knee-jerk reaction to...
Well, the League of Nations was the prototype.
Yes. Yeah.
In many ways, and it left actually a much more positive legacy in many directions. It was the prototype for the High Commissioner for Refugees, prototype for WHO, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But the analogy is not entirely good. And just the last point, I don't think we should throw out the UN because there is a snowball's chance in hell that these member states will be able to agree on anything, let alone a new organization. And this little booklet that I showed, if we reopen it, other than taking out those two anachronisms, can you imagine the size of it? Even if we do think that we may achieve something, it'll probably be like the budget that Ronald Reagan brought to the US Congress back in 80.
It would be the longest running forum in
Absolutely. And it'll be an open-ended working group to come to something, and we'll never come to anything.
That's absolutely right. Miroslav, what do you think? I mean, what we're focusing on, what I'd like to focus on, is that the stumbling block to UN or Security Council reform is basically the veto, isn't it?
I think there are several issues. It is not only veto. The efforts to change, to reform Security Council have been here for more than 20 years. So it is not a question of yesterday or 2 days ago or 1 year ago. It is a long-standing question, and there are several issues. One issue is veto power. Another issue is representation. David was mentioning 35 members, representation of regions, continents. Definitely it is a huge anachronism that Africa, Latin America are not represented permanently there. We have India. Depending on which statistics you take into account, the most or the second most populous country in the world.
Well, it's the most populous country now.
So, there is a huge question. Now, speaking about regional organizations, you asked a question about the European Union. Actually, if you look at P5, from European Union, it is France. Would France be ready to give up this seat in favor of European Union? You ask our French colleagues.
That's rhetorical.
That's very rhetorical. I think that we all suspect we know the answer. My point is that, we have member states as they are. We are not going to change the member states. What we need is to find political will that you were mentioning what it is. So really to find political will to actually adhere to the Charter, to international law, to, let's say, respect those norms and implement them. Second, when we talk about political will, and you mentioned, Stephen, in your introduction, global challenges, as Secretary General mentioned them, be it climate change, financing for development, poverty, post-COVID recovery, sustainable development goals. We are lagging behind. There will be summit on sustainable development goals in September, actually to energize member states to meet the objectives that are there. So there are global challenges, and we cannot simply, solve them without without member states, countries, globally cooperating.
Well,
It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, that was the message I took from this morning, cooperation, in all ways, on all fronts and all groupings. But coming back to the Council, I'm sorry to hammer this a little more, but the Secretary-General says the UN is, in his words, increasingly crippled by great power rivalry. The relationship between the three biggest powers, America, China and Russia, has never been as dysfunctional as it is today. How do you address that?
To me?
Yeah, whoever.
Look, how do we address that is also, answered by the Secretary General that he is proposing. I mentioned our common agenda. I mentioned a new agenda for peace that will be released soon, and Summit of the Future.
What does that mean, a new agenda for peace?
New agenda for peace means how to reinvent United Nations in the area of peace and security in order to make world safer, more secure. It deals with the areas like now more and more we speak about the danger of nuclear conflict, of possible use, God forbid, of nuclear arms. So how to come back to the treaties and find opportunity, find ways to commitment so nuclear weapons will never be used, and we can, even if it now may look like pretty, ideal objective, get rid of nuclear weapons. It is about prevention. We spoke about Charter, that this is preventive document, save future generations from the scourge of war. But how to make this prevention happen? Because we see during last years, actually we see more conflicts than less, more complex conflicts. How better use good offices, mediation, facilitation, different ways of good offices of Secretary General. Today, it was mentioned also here, human rights area. We didn't speak today about gender, about the role of women. Actually, if we look at those conflicts, we see that women are suffering during those conflicts disproportionately more than men. And we can continue with climate security, etc. So, those are the areas, role of peacekeeping. What will be the peacekeeping in the future? Peace enforcement. Can we use force in situations like, when we have two countries fighting together in order to enforce peace or ending of the conflict? Those are big issues, and those issues, they can be resolved only at the global level in the platform that the United Nations offers, by realizing that they are practically doing harm if not discontinued, if not stopped, to everyone. You mentioned division of world. Let's talk about digital technology. We are under threat of, let's say, dividing the world in practically two separate systems.
It's turning into, David, you mentioned how the United Nations is now after the Cold War. It was perhaps a more straightforward division up to the end of the Cold War. Now it isn't. It's more complex. It's more piecemeal. It's a giant jigsaw, isn't it? So that's why you need a functioning Security Council more now than ever.
Whenever I hear the title, A New Agenda for Peace, the question invariably comes up in my mind, so does anybody remember what happened to the original Agenda for Peace? And what happened to that brilliant document, very lean, brilliant document, was that the member states did not basically dance to what it was suggesting, which is the fate of most reform initiatives by Secretaries General. And herein lies a problem with this picture. It's the member states who own the organization. They are supposed to come up with these innovations, these new directions, new projects, etc. And the Secretary General should say, yes, that's a very good idea, we will implement it. However, in the absence of leadership from the member states, the Secretary Generals, actually succeeding Secretaries General, continue to try to reinvent the organization on the whole, while the member states are cutting the budget repeatedly of one principal organ, that is of the Secretariat, and showing that off as reform of the organization. I'm sorry, it is not the reform of the organization. And speaking of cutting budgets, it's interesting to note that the term group of donors or major donors to the UN never existed before 1991. Because before that, in the good old bipolar world, the member states paid their dues and the Secretary General apportioned the dues on the right shelf where they were needed. And with the coming of the New World, the UN budget started being cut, and suddenly 22 donors appeared who are paying extra budgetary funds. And when you get these extra budgetary funds, they say, yeah, we cut your budget, but you need some money, here's some money. Oh, by the way, did we tell you that we'd like you to do this, use this money for this project? Yeah, okay, I figured. Oh, by the way, did we tell you that we have an excellent person to run this project? So that is the reality, I'm afraid. And the Security Council has, we can't even talk about the P5. We have to talk about the P3 and the P2, lately.
Well, that's what the Secretary General says is dysfunctional.
Exactly, it's dysfunctional, of course. Because they were, look, just last thing, the Security Council, as the whole of the UN, but especially the Security Council, was created for, to have a place where member states who had disagreements outside, let's colloquially call it, you know, fist fights in the car park, they were supposed to go to this chamber and discuss in a civilized way, horse trade, negotiate, engage in diplomacy. Unfortunately, they are bringing their fistfights into the Security Council and marking points against each other. And this is what the Security Council has become.
Just before we move on to a question for Terhi, I think, about the UN and all the organizations involved in the UN. David, just a personal question, because you are retired, I think, from the UN now. You know the Secretary General better than anybody, I suspect, in this room. I've interviewed him twice before he was Secretary General. But what is his thinking now? Because he's being extremely vocal, isn't he, about a number of issues. Is that a sign of, you don't have to answer, a sign of frustration, or he just feels hemmed in, or he feels he can't do anything about what is happening? What is his mindset?
I wouldn't purport to know the Secretary General any better than Miroslav would. Miroslav would know him much better because he is Assistant Secretary General and he is in contact with the Secretary General much more often,
well,
and especially in view of his position in the Department of Political and Peacekeeping Affairs. I would not venture there. What I may say would be just my personal observations, but I defer to my senior colleague.
No personal observations. Miroslav, do you want to get personal, or would you like me to move on? I mean, I would be interested in how you think he's feeling and what his attitude is at the moment.
Look, Stephen, you can ask me anything. I think that this is what this audience is waiting for. So
exactly.
I actually have like 5 pages of prepared answers. I can go to them, but I'm sure that it will not be that interesting. First, yes, he is frustrated. And I think that he shows it when he speaks about those challenges, that they are not moving ahead. But on the other hand, he is the leader of the global organization and he has responsibility. This is why he has come with the ideas, with our common agenda, a new agenda for peace. And I wouldn't be so skeptical about original agenda for peace by Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Many things happened. Actually, in the 90s, I would like to say that it was, you know, a beautiful example of cooperation among states. Situation started getting worse later on. Obviously, we need something new. But there are also, you know, there are some positive sides as well. Look, Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27 last year, you know, it was possible to find agreement on loss and damage fund. It was seen, you know, as unthinkable some time ago, and it happened. So, you know, climate agenda is here. COP members, you know, members of the United Nations, they are meeting together. This year it will be in United Arab Emirates. And it continues. I think that the growing awareness of the challenges of possible catastrophe is here. Speaking about, you know, reforming of international financial institutions. We heard today Kristalina Georgieva, and, you know, that's what is in front of the world from the point of view of finances. There is discussion. It is happening. So, you know, I would like to also to see the other side. Usually we are very critical. And let's see also that when we talk about member states, yes, it is true that, of course, first of all, member states are, you know, the owners of the organization. But at the same time, there needs to be interaction between Secretary General and member states. And member states are waiting from the Secretary General to come up with initiatives. So new agenda for peace is not just piece of paper that was prepared in some, you know, dark offices in the UN Secretariat in Turtle Bay, but it is a process of consultations with member states, with regional groups, with academia, with regional organizations. OSCE representative was talking today, earlier, Helga Schmidt. And we value those inputs. So it is a consultative process, and we hope that in the end we will get some kind of guidelines for the future to change the situation, deplorable situation we are in now.
And some would say that so those processes sometimes take an inordinately long time, longer than necessary. But I want to go to Turkey. And I wonder whether the UN now, Miroslav listed all its functions, well, a lot of its functions, and how spread it is around the world with so many challenges. My point is the UN overexposed? Does it have too many fingers in too many pies? Just on a personal level, over the weekend, I did a Google search on the UN. And so for 3 consecutive days, I had a list of about 10 different stories involving 10 different departments and actions by the UN. It was huge. It was disparate. And it was a lot of work for a lot of different organizations. And I wonder if perhaps the time is now to close in a bit, to focus a bit harder.
Based on my personal experience, I think that when you look at for instance, the field operations, I mean, and the field presence of different UN organizations, I'm sure there is some streamlining to do, because, I mean, from a donor's point of view, like the European Union, many UN organizations are actually dealing with some agendas are overlapping, and this has been discussed. And I think one of the reforms also in the field and, you know, country offices and regional offices has been already that there is a regional coordinator, there's a country coordinator, so that all the UN institutions and UN organizations are under one person. So the coordination is already improved, because this will have an impact, of course, on financing. the worry here is, of course, as David was saying, that, I mean, we don't have enough financing for all the needs, actually, what we have in...
Isn't that what I'm saying?
Yes, and this is exactly, I think that could be one of the reform goals, and it has been already, so I hope that this will go on, because it would, from the donors' point of view, like European Union, and we are also a very good partner and supporter of UN, but we see, of course, sometimes that the agendas are overlapping, and there is a bit competition between different organizations for the same money, exactly what we have at our disposal. So, I mean, that is one of the discussions we have already on the table and between
well,
the
UN is
member
very
states.
good at discussions.
Yes, I mean, yeah, but that's part of diplomacy. I mean, because when you stop discussing, the shooting starts usually. So, I mean, that's my experience too. So it's better to have a dialogue. This is exactly why we are here. Better to discuss and all that, because that's the only way to gain something, because we have to have everybody, all member states, we have to have a civil society or ownership of the decisions we are doing. And we all know that the money is scarce. I mean, we have more problems than we have money. That's the bottom line.
David.
Sorry, I'm mindful of the time, Stephen.
No, don't worry about that.
Just a comment, an illustration. Miroslav mentioned, and quite correctly, that there have been some positive instances. Those two positive instances, there were two at the beginning of the 90s. One was the UNTAC, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, where the Soviets played ball. It was still the Soviet Union. And the second was Desert Storm. And that brings me to the two ways, the right way and the wrong way of using the Security Council. The right way was under George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 41, and James Baker, then Secretary of State. He put in 37 hours in 24 hours. He flew practically to all the capitals of all, not just P5, but all the members of the Security Council. The only one he did not manage to make it to was Beijing, and Beijing abstained. So Baker got 13 votes for, 1 abstention, and 1 Yemen was against. Now, let's move to 2003 and the second Iraq war. And this is also illustrative, not only of how not to do diplomacy in the Security Council, because there George W. Bush said, if the UN can't agree on this, it's irrelevant. That was the wrong approach. But the more interesting illustrative thing here is that in that context, it wasn't China and Russia that were against the United States' position. It was actually France and Germany, who was at the time alternate member. And you may remember that the French foreign minister at the time, Dominique de Villepin, after his impassioned speech, got a standing ovation, which is a rarity in the Security Council. So my point is that the performance of the Security Council depends very much on how much effort the member states put in to negotiate, to get their point across. You just come in knowing a priori that the other side, whatever the number of the side, will be against it without consultation, and you put something in blue, which is the UN lingo for tabling a draft resolution. You know they're going to be against it, so you're going to say, you see? How can you work with these people? That's not the way to do business in the Security Council, I'm afraid.
Of course not.
Thank you.
Miroslav, David made that great point about negotiation. The Secretary General wants what he calls bold and swift action to meet the global challenges he's talked about, using his specialized communication and negotiation techniques. What are those techniques?
Look, there are, different levels, different ways, depending on the issue, on the challenge. I started with mentioning Sustainable Development Goals Summit. That is to take place in September on the margins of the General Assembly this year. So there is opportunity for Secretary General to convene all the members, that subscribed to Sustainable Development Goals and are lagging behind. So have this discussion at the highest level, all membership, and at the same time, try to, revitalize this effort, try to find resources behind it, and get member states, to invest in actually achieving those goals. So I spoke about now about summits. But then Secretary General, when we look at Black Sea Grain Initiative, so he is working with, let's say, the sides here, with the parties, and it is an example where Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, United Nations work together in order to get grain from Ukraine and also grain and then Secretary General has special envoys, he has special representatives. Let me mention, since we are in Central Asia, that there is a regional center for preventive diplomacy based in Ashgabat. I had an honor to be first SRSG head of this center. This is, I would say, very tiny UN structure with budget less than 3 million, but it does work that is absolutely necessary. It is about prevention. It is about being available when it is needed, when there is a need for, let's say, finding solutions to difficult questions, tensions, let's say about water sharing. In 2010, when there were, ethnic clashes in Kyrgyzstan, so we were there and we helped to calm down the situation. So the short answer to your question is that, the ways, the modalities, different formats are huge depending on the challenge. And actually it is also in the Charter of the United Nations speaking about those good offices, negotiation, mediation, etc. So to use all of them to try to prevent conflict. When there are natural disasters, we can see Secretary General immediately there, floods in Pakistan, immediately flew there and mobilized the international community to help people to somehow go through those very difficult tragedies, very difficult times.
That's a very good example of Mr. Guterres' work. Terhi or Miroslav, I don't want to give you a hard time, Miroslav, so David or Terhi can answer this. Any negotiators we know in a business situation need some leverage, something in his back pocket to make a deal, some power, some resource, some backable threat to bring the sides to agreement or possibly ceasefire. What does the UN offer, Terhi, for example, apart from neutrality? Because Mr. Guterres says very proudly the UN has created tools for advancing diplomacy and development and multilateral solutions to global problems. What are the sort of tools the UN is using? Terhi?
What are the tools UN is using? Sorry, I missed the part. I thought that, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm just saying that in a business negotiation, you always need something in your back pocket.
Sure.
You need a bit of leverage. So what kind of leverage does the UN offer to bring sides together? What kind of tools does the Secretary General have at his resource to bring conflicts to an end? What would he be saying to the two sides involved in the conflict we're seeing at the moment between Ukraine and Russia?
Between Ukraine and Russia, obviously, the situation is absolutely so complicated that we need other players at the table than UN, let's face it. It's highly political, the convening power in this kind of situation is also with other big players. I mean, Turkey was mentioned, China,
South Korea.
Yes. So I mean, and this is the war now, which has a very difficult, so to say, it will be difficult to solve, and the main thing is that. What we try to do from the European Union point of view when it comes now to this conflict is that we try to put a stop and to end it and to stop it. We have different ways. We try to limit the possibilities of Russian Federation to continue the war. I mean, we have sanction policy. That's the way, because we don't want to have war. We want the war to be ended today. And we try to kind of make sure that it cannot continue for a long time. The question is that in a conflict situation, of course, you have to find a way to, you have to have the political will to settle the conflict. And UN can offer many good, many good assistance to end. I mean, first of all, I mean, there are all kinds of tools. The field offices are doing it. The peacekeeping operations are there. If you have to separate the parties to the conflict, I'm talking about any conflict now, not just the Ukrainian-Russian war at the moment. But there has to be a political will, or you have to force to peace. That's I see two different phases. But there will be always the next day. Conflicts will always end one way or another. We are not there yet with this Ukraine-Russia conflict that the parties would be ready to negotiate. But in any conflict, I mean, then there's the next day. You can have peacekeeping operations, you can have reconstruction, you can have different programs to stabilize the situation, and help both parties to accept the solution, because the point in any conflict is that if you have no ownership to the solution, you have to live with it, I mean, after the war. So that's also the thing.
Just explain what ownership to the solution means.
The ownership to the solution is that, I mean, that there is an acceptance of
so
both sides will accept that this is it. I mean, we will accept it and we will solve the problem like this, and then we'll live on with the help of international community, most probably with UN operations. That's it. But I mean, both sides has to feel it, because I mean, if you try to end a conflict and one side stays weaker or feels that I was not treated.
Well, that's the art of diplomacy.
Yes.
So neither side thinks they've lost.
Exactly,
that's
exactly.
But the list of, you call them conflicts or challenges, is a long one.
Yes.
Isn't it? It's
yes.
not just in Ukraine. They include Myanmar, the Sahel, Somalia, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, and beyond. Are all those examples of UN failure?
No, not necessarily. No, I think UN is doing its best. But, you know, as I said, that, I mean, in this, UN cannot force to peace if there is no political will on the sides of the parties to the conflict. I mean, it has to, UN can lead the way, UN can open doors, facilitate, but the real thing has to happen between the parties also, you know, to agree.
Well, in that case, they could get on without the UN then.
No, why?
Okay. David.
Thank you. Conflicts are very similar in nature, but yet very different. They're similar in the sense that they all leave the impression of being intractable. And then at some point, when the right button is pushed or the right moment is achieved, they suddenly find a resolution. But as a general proposition, conflicts will not cease, a given conflict will not cease until such time as one side either loses or is no longer able to continue fighting. And then the terms will be in connection with the situation. But you asked a very good question. What does the UN bring to bear? The UN has this instrument of Special Representative of the Secretary General, of which Miroslav was one. Again, he's probably better placed to describe the institution, but there are different criteria. Language, knowledge of the region, of the conflict, that's important. Being from Scandinavia is considered, you can do anything, anywhere. But also, every once in a while, you get a heavyweight from a heavyweight country. And again, I want to go back to former Secretary of State Baker, who was appointed by Kofi Annan as his personal envoy on the Western Sahara issue. There was an SRSG, a Special Representative of the Secretary General. There was a director of the Identification Commission, but this was personal envoy. And he brought the heft and the power of the United States, of the US economic might, and very, very subliminally, the Sixth Fleet or the Fifth Fleet or
Which
whatever.
is what I'm talking about in the back pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. And he never alluded to it. But when you saw
You don't have to,
and
do you?
yet when he managed to get an agreement, a tentative agreement with President Bouteflika at the time on a secret mission to Algiers, on the spur of the moment, we flew to Tindouf to meet with the then, now late Secretary General of Polisario. And we arrived there at midnight and left at 3 o'clock. And the Polisario chief basically said, well, no, even though Bouteflika suggests, but no, we don't want this. I later asked, in the next meeting, I asked one of the Polisario ambassadors, I said, listen, when somebody like James Baker flies in at midnight to Tindouf to give you a fair deal and you say no to it, who do you expect to come down the pike after him? I said. And lo and behold, this problem continues. And it's actually, another interesting aspect is it's an orphan conflict. Because it was a conflict of the Cold War. The Soviets were behind Algeria, Algeria was behind the Polisario, the US was behind Morocco, Morocco was a party to the conflict. And with the Soviet Union's dissolution, now Algeria is the one behind it. So it's an orphan conflict.
Thank you, David. That's a great story. I'm wondering, we started talking about reform. Do you want to come in before I move on, Miroslav? Okay.
You said you would ask me, let's say, a question together with Terry, but then you kept grilling Terry. So I feel a little bit, in solidarity.
Okay.
No, because
what have you got to negotiate?
we work very closely with European Union. I also mentioned OSCE. My point is that regional organizations are playing important role.
That was I was about to ask you, AUKUS and such organizations.
It is, it is also in the charter, but regional organizations, they know better the situation on the ground. They can help, better. Look at, Western Balkans is interesting example. Today, the chair of presidency of Western Balkan spoke, she mentioned challenges there, maybe some anachronisms. I'm not going to touch upon, definitely. But what I wanted to say that there is a huge role of European Union that we support, including in the dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade, the perspective of membership in the European Union. So there is a very strong incentive for cooperation you were asking for. And it doesn't have to come from the United Nations. Look, we are not saints either. So if there were questions about, UN and all those endless talks and how efficiently we use the resources, definitely there is a lot to improve. Now, it is not only about negative sides. Let me mention here, one fantastic example where Security Council even today is in agreement, and it is peace process in Colombia. It's fantastic example of, let's say, good offices of the United Nations, then special political mission, laying down of arms, and actually the agreement, peace accords that were signed in 2016, they survived several presidents. I'm sorry?
This is with FARC.
Yes, this is with FARC. So it was the government with FARC, and now FARC is political party practically.
Directly by the UN?
I'm sorry?
Was that brokered directly by the UN?
It was, you know, those two sides, they came to understanding that they need support of the United Nations. And in 2015, they approached Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who asked me to travel to Havana in Cuba to meet with the parties and start process how we can, you know, together prepare peace agreement. And this was done, and it is third president in Colombia in a row, and peace agreements are being implemented. And not only that, now practically in the final stage are talks between the government and National Liberation Army, Ejército de Liberación Nacional, about ceasefire. So, and it is assisted by the United Nations. But on the other hand, Ukraine was mentioned several times, you know, Sudan, Syria, Libya. What is happening that conflicts are becoming, you know, more difficult. There are many more sides. There are proxies there. So if we look at the war in Ukraine, and Secretary General was very clear, you know, who violated international law and the charter here, but actually we have all 5 permanent members in one way or another engaged with China, of course, being neutral and proposing a peace plan here. But there are many such peace proposals there, and definitely I fully agree with Terry here that we see that it will be among member states, you know, those key players to find a solution. Obviously, Ukraine and its leadership must be there. It cannot be resolved in any other way.
Well, we're approaching the end, but I was sort of thinking last night about what we're facing at the moment. Climate crisis, deepening climate crisis, soaring inequalities, rising threat from terrorism, a global pushback against human rights, unregulated development of dangerous technologies. I didn't mention AI. They're all possibly dangerous threats. I wonder if they all need the UN to be involved. And can I use that as a springboard into your final thoughts, just going along the panel, starting you, David, Terhi, and then Miroslav. David.
Thank you. All of this list can usefully have the UN involved. Doesn't mean that it has to have the UN involved. Part of the reason why you noticed what you noticed, Stephen, that the UN seems to be doing everything everywhere, is because the member states are quite happy for the UN to be otherwise occupied and not get into their security issues that they don't want the UN to be part of. This goes for disarmament, this goes for conflicts where the P5 are involved or have a big stake. So sort of a bounce off of that is the famous admonition to one of our past secretaries general that you better be secretary, more secretary than general. And that's a tongue-in-cheek expression of the member states created the organization, and they want to determine where they want the UN involved and to what level, and where they are happy to let the UN play. That's my read of this.
Terhi, final words?
Well, I come back to what I said, that the United Nations are we all. So it depends on the governments what they want to raise in the General Assembly. So all these issues you mentioned, they are somehow interlinked. There are interdependencies. They can be discussed, and I agree with David that, of course, I mean, the lead can be taken somewhere else. I mean, how to develop, where to find solutions, but it's up to the member states to take them up, and then UN will deal with it, I mean, because we want them to deal with it. But I want to say also that, for instance, what comes to the new technologies, artificial intelligence, IT, so for instance, the EU is the leading regulator here. We have taken decisions, regulations, you know, which are actually, so we are leading in the world, so we can give example, or some other area, some other region can give a lead to some other issues. I mean, we know that small island states are very active in climate change issue, etc. So, I mean, the impulse comes always either from the regions or it comes from the groups of countries or individual countries. So, I mean, it's not that UN is actually kind of after anything, but the discussion takes place there in many cases. How it will proceed depends on the member states again.
Yep.
Thank you.
Always jaw, not war. Miroslav?
I think that when we have global challenges, you mentioned climate change, you mentioned other global challenges, I think that all we would understand that we need global solutions, because those challenges are affecting everyone. So we need a platform, we need a body that can provide us some kind of path to the future that would be stable, peaceful. Second, and I'm grateful to Kazakhstan for organizing this forum, because I think it is also showing the way forward. Yes, we can look at the United Nations, you are responsible, but what you can do to success. And Kazakhstan has been very active while supporting United Nations, but at the same time taking difficult commitments. You know, look at denuclearization, for example. The polygon was closed here. Now in Central Asia, there is a working nuclear-free zone. It is, I think, a very important achievement. Then being platform for negotiations, be it Syria or other issues. So it is happening also here in Kazakhstan. Digital technology, let's say climate change, green economy. You know, we see Kazakhstan as trying to show leadership. Regional cooperation, extremely important in that respect. Today, a lot was said about, you know, how to do better. I would like to say that, you know, much more needs to be done. There is a lot of words, but actually when it comes to the deeds, so a lot more is needed. President Tokayev used to be Director General of a UN office in Geneva, definitely here, David could say much more than myself, and knows, you know, very well the system, how it works, including personal relationship with Secretary General Guterres, who at that time was High Representative, High Commissioner for Refugees. You know, so there is this partnership, and what we need is partnership, is working together, but also doing, you know, more us. Not only expecting that somebody else, UN, will do it for us. And then I will end a little bit with small, you know, anecdote. When I was head of Regional Center for Preventive Diplomacy, and I was asked, so how many conflicts you prevented? What would you answer?
Well, I was going to ask you that.
So, you know, it's very difficult, because if you say you prevented conflict, so others would say, no, it's you are exaggerating. But then when something happens, you are responsible. And many times we see United Nations as this kind of scapegoat we can point our fingers to. I think, other than that, let's focus on partnership, on working together.
And cooperation. Thank you. I think we agree, in conclusion, the mood is one, certainly for me, of change and reform. The Security Council has to re-examine its composition to better address the complex and, what I've made a note here, the evolving challenges to international peace and security. Regarding the veto, we touched on it, the ability of the P5 to block any proposal in the Security Council creates permanent gridlock. One option could be to enable the General Assembly to override vetoes, but at a minimum, China and Russia, and perhaps all P5 states, would veto such a measure. It may be the impossible dream of every US administration since, I think, Bill Clinton has endorsed enlargement, but reform proposals has never involved the veto. No country will willingly give up that veto, or let the veto be weakened by a non-binding norm. But the UN still needs a big reality check, in my opinion, a deep, hard, long look at itself and what it does and what it's involved with, because the world is getting more of a jigsaw. It's breaking up into groupings, and it's very, very complex, the sort of challenges. There are more acronyms than a game of Scrabble sometimes. China says the world today is more interconnected than ever, and it needs to join hands globally to meet the challenges we face. And I think that's right, because they want to create conditions for trust. We need a truly effective international, but I think slimmed down organization for this century to start building that trust again. And I think we need it now more than ever. Ladies and gentlemen in the panel, thank you very much indeed.